I kept my multi-million inheritance secret at my sister's wedding until her groom called me poor, and the words slammed into the ballroom like a gavel of judgment, silencing the orchestra for a heartbeat before laughter erupted like cruel applause. The chandeliers glittered overhead, each crystal catching the golden light, as if mocking me, magnifying my humiliation. Ethan's voice rang through the microphone with the confidence of a man, certain the room adored him. At least Vanessa didn't end up like her sister, poor and pitiful. My blood chilled, my breath stuck in my throat, but before I could even blink, Vanessa leaned into him, her diamond earrings swaying as she pressed her lips to his ear. Her smirk curling like smoke, and she whispered loud enough for those at the front tables to hear. She should be grateful we even let her in. The cruelty was deliberate, sharpened like a blade, and the nearest guests gasped, their eyes darting toward me. But then one man at Ethan's law firm chuckled nervously, tipping his glass as if forced to laugh along, and suddenly, laughter spread like contagion, awkward and biting, rolling over me until it felt like the carpet itself was vibrating with scorn. Some guests glanced away quickly, guilt flashing across their faces as though they knew the insult was too much, but their silence stung as sharply as the laughter of those who delighted in my public shaming. I sat frozen in my chair, my navy dress suddenly feeling like a costume of invisibility, my hands digging into the clutch on my lap until the metal clasp cut into my skin. Inside the envelope pressed against my fingers like a heartbeat, the proof of a truth no one in that room suspected the truth I had hidden, not out of weakness but out of calculation. Vanessa straightened, raising her champagne flute toward me as though to seal her words, her eyes gleaming with triumph, and mouthed across the sea of sequins and tuxedos. "You'll never measure up." I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, forcing myself to stay still, to let the humiliation wash over me, because this moment was not the end, but the stage for something greater. My ears rang with the blend of whispers and chuckles, some pitying, others cruel the orchestra attempting to rescue the atmosphere with a cheerful waltz that only sounded like mockery. My heart pounded so violently I thought others might hear it, but I straightened my spine, inhaling the perfume-drenched air thick with roses and champagne, and I whispered to myself so low only I could hear, "They think they buried me, but tonight I will rise from their laughter." The chandeliers seemed to tremble as Ethan clinked his glass again, drawing more attention, bragging about Vanessa's brilliance, about how she was destined for greatness while tossing in another jab. Imagine if she had turned out like Bella, what a tragedy that would have been. Vanessa laughed loud and proud, tugging on his arm as if he were her weapon. Around the room, reactions fractured the crowd. An older woman pressed her lips together in disapproval, but stayed seated. A younger couple exchanged shocked glances, and a man at the back whispered, "That's too harsh." Yet, no one rose. No one defended me. Their silence was complicity, and I absorbed every second, searing the details into memory, because soon I would return their laughter with something far louder. Ethan spun Vanessa dramatically into their first dance, as applause erupted their smiles wide, the perfect couple framed by glitter and light. But as they twirled, I sat alone in the corner, clutch pressed tight. Fury turned to resolve, and in the cavern of my heart, a vow rang clear. They thought they crowned themselves tonight, but what they had really done was hand me the perfect stage for their destruction. When people looked at Vanessa and me growing up, they saw two sisters born just 2 years apart, both with dark hair and the same almond-shaped eyes. But in my family's world, we were never equals. Vanessa was the golden child, the shining jewel my parents paraded before neighbors and relatives, while I was the quiet shadow expected to stay out of the spotlight. I remember birthdays when the living room would be filled with balloons and cake for Vanessa, the air thick with laughter and the smell of vanilla frosting, while mine would pass with a single cupcake and a candle, my parents claiming they were too tired from work or that money was tight that week. Yet somehow there was always enough for Vanessa's skating lessons, her piano recitals, her designer clothes, even when she was just a teenager. I grew used to the subtle ways they drew lines between us, the way my mother's face lit up when Vanessa walked into a room, the way my father's voice softened when he asked about her day, while his tone with me was brisk, practical, often dismissive. The unfairness stung most in small, ordinary moments. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was about 12, standing at the kitchen counter peeling potatoes while Vanessa twirled in a new dress, showing off to our visiting relatives. My aunt clapped her hands, declaring how beautiful she was, how lucky my parents were to have such a daughter, and my mother nodded proudly, never once mentioning the hours I spent helping her prepare the meal, never once pointing out my steady grades or the patience I showed with chores no one else wanted. Vanessa grew addicted to praise feeding on it, learning how to tilt her head, just so how to make her laughter ring sweetly, how to cry at just the right moment to draw sympathy. I grew addicted too, but not to praise. I grew addicted to watching quietly, storing every slight, every forgotten moment as though building a ledger in my heart. That ledger would become the foundation of my resolve years later. School was no better. Teachers adored Vanessa for her bubbly charm, her ability to make friends instantly, while I was labeled the serious one, the responsible one, the girl who always had her homework done but never caught the eye. When awards assemblies came, Vanessa's name echoed across the gymnasium for art competitions, for cheerleading, for student council, while I sat clapping politely, my certificate for perfect attendance crumpled in my hand. By high school, the gap widened. Vanessa dated quarterbacks, attended prom in gowns my parents spent weeks shopping for, while I saved babysitting money just to buy my own dress from a clearance rack. On prom night, I watched her leave in a limousine, cameras flashing as my parents took pictures, while I quietly walked down the driveway with a boy from debate club. No photos, no fanfare, only the distant sound of laughter as the limo pulled away. Yet despite it all, I didn't despise Vanessa then. I thought if I worked harder, if I proved myself one day, my parents might look at me with the same pride. I studied late into the night, pushed myself in science fairs, won a local essay contest, but when I showed my parents the certificate, my father simply nodded and said, "That's nice," before turning to ask Vanessa about her cheerleading practice. Those moments cut deeper than open insults. It was neglect wrapped in everyday life, an erasure so casual it convinced me for years that I truly was less, that maybe I deserved invisibility. But there were cracks in their golden narrative. Vanessa was spoiled reckless and often cruel to others. I watched her laugh at classmates who wore thrift store clothes, roll her eyes at teachers who demanded effort, and manipulate friends into doing her homework. My parents ignored it, blinded by her smile. And yet when I confronted Vanessa once, telling her she shouldn't treat people that way, she turned to me with icy disdain and said, "No one cares what you think, Bella." That sentence burned into me like acid, seared so deeply that even years later, sitting at her wedding, I heard its echo in Ethan's words. Still in those childhood years, I learned endurance. I learned to smile politely when forgotten to hold my tongue, when dismissed to build a quiet strength no one recognized. Vanessa may have had the crown, but I was building armor. Adolescence sharpened the divide between us into something unignorable, a canyon carved deeper each year. By the time I was 16, my role in the family had become crystal clear. I was the one who sacrificed, who compromised, who bent so Vanessa could shine brighter. When the time came to apply for summer programs, I begged to join a science camp at the local university. My guidance counselor said I had real potential, that I might find mentors there who could open doors. I brought home the pamphlet, Heart Racing, but my father barely looked up from his newspaper. "Too expensive," he said flatly. 2 weeks later, my mother showed me a receipt for Vanessa's new dance intensive in New York City, triple the cost of the science camp. Vanessa strutted around the house, bragging about Broadway auditions she might watch while I folded the pamphlet and buried it at the bottom of my drawer. That was the pattern my ambitions clipped hers, indulged. At 17, when I was invited to represent our school at a state debate competition, the travel fee was deemed unnecessary, but the very same month, my parents financed Vanessa's prom limousine salon and a custom gown. I told myself it was temporary, that college would free me, yet college, too, became a battlefield. I earned scholarships through relentless studying, working part-time at the library to cover textbooks, while Vanessa breezed into a private university on my parents' dime, her tuition and dorm fully paid. When she called home complaining about the cafeteria food, my parents overnighted her packages of snacks. When I called saying I needed help with rent during a rough semester, my father's voice turned cold. "You're old enough to figure it out." So I did. I worked double shifts at a diner, cleaned apartments, and sold my old guitar to cover bills. The sacrifices weren't just financial. They were emotional, physical, invisible threads woven into my youth. I sacrificed nights out to babysit so my parents could attend Vanessa's recitals. I gave up vacations to stay home and care for my grandmother when they traveled with Vanessa to Europe. Each sacrifice was met not with gratitude, but with silence, as though it was my natural role to absorb hardship so Vanessa could flourish. And yet, in the quiet hours after double shifts, hunched over textbooks with aching hands, I discovered something Vanessa never did: resilience. By 21, I had founded a small startup with two classmates working from a cramped apartment with second-hand laptops eating instant noodles for weeks. The company focused on medical technology software that streamlined patient data for clinics. While Vanessa posted photos from sorority formals in glittering gowns, I was cold calling investors surviving on caffeine and grit. My parents dismissed it as a hobby. Vanessa sneered, asking once at Thanksgiving, "So you're still playing pretend CEO?" The words stung, but I swallowed them, hiding my anger the way I always had. What she never knew was that the pretend company would one day change everything. Those years of sacrifice of learning to survive without safety nets taught me how to build from nothing. Every door slammed in my face only fueled me more. I coded late into the night, pitched to anyone who would listen, endured rejection after rejection until one investor finally believed. And when our software was adopted by a hospital network, the first check we received was more than my parents had ever spent on me in my life. Still, I kept it quiet. I told no one. My company grew, acquired contracts expanded. And then came the acquisition, a staggering buyout that left me with a fortune, tens of millions wired into my account almost overnight. My hands shook as I stared at the numbers, not with disbelief, but with the weight of vindication. All those years of sacrifice had not been wasted. Yet I did not run to my parents with the news. I remembered every dismissal, every sacrifice unacknowledged. Instead, I tucked the truth close to my chest. I lived simply, blending in, never flaunting wealth. Vanessa and my parents still called me poor, pitiful, a woman barely scraping by. I let them, because sacrifice had taught me something else: patience. The world didn't need to know yet. But when the right moment came, when the stage was brightest, I would reveal the truth, and that revelation would taste sweeter than any praise they had ever denied me. By the time I reached my mid-20s, I had learned to wear invisibility like armor. My parents still saw me as the practical one, the daughter who managed on scraps, while Vanessa remained their dazzling star. It was during one rare family dinner that Ethan Caldwell first appeared in our lives. He arrived with the kind of swagger that filled the room before he even opened his mouth, tall, immaculately groomed, his watch glinting beneath the chandelier. Vanessa clung to his arm as though he were both trophy and shield, introducing him with a theatrical flourish. "This is Ethan, my future." I studied him quietly, the way his eyes scanned the table, not with curiosity but with assessment, as if calculating what each of us was worth. When his gaze settled on me, his lips curled almost imperceptibly, the kind of smirk that dismissed without a word. The conversation over dinner was painfully predictable. Ethan bragged about his law firm, his connections, his plans to build a practice that would dominate the city. My parents hung on every word, nodding eagerly, peppering him with questions that allowed him to boast further. Vanessa laughed at all the right moments, tilting her head, playing the perfect supporting role. When I asked a simple question about his current cases, his eyes flickered with irritation before he replied curtly, "You wouldn't understand Bella. It's complicated." The dismissal wasn't just rude, it was calculated, designed to remind me of my place. My parents let it pass without comment. That night, as I washed dishes while Vanessa and Ethan cuddled in the living room, I overheard him whisper to her, "Your sister's pathetic, still living like a student." Vanessa giggled in response, her voice dripping with agreement. "She always will be." The words sliced through me, but I stayed silent, stacking plates as though they were shields against the truth. Over the months that followed, Ethan's presence became permanent. He attended family gatherings, charming relatives, flaunting gifts for my parents, showering Vanessa with jewelry. Each time, his contempt for me grew bolder. At a 4th of July barbecue, he leaned across the picnic table smirking as he asked, "So Bella's still working that little project of yours? Must be hard, making rent." Laughter erupted around the table, my parents chuckling nervously, Vanessa biting her lip to suppress a grin. I smiled thinly, saying nothing. hiding the knowledge that my little project had recently secured another contract worth millions. The secrecy was suffocating, but necessary. I wasn't ready to reveal the truth, not yet. Ethan was not simply arrogant, he was strategic. He began isolating Vanessa, encouraging her to see me less, to roll her eyes when I spoke, to treat me as a family burden. It was manipulation disguised as devotion, and my parents applauded it. I saw the pattern he wanted: complete control of Vanessa and, by extension, my parents' approval, their social circle, their resources. I watched, silently documenting his tactics in the back of my mind. The cruelty escalated at smaller gatherings. At my mother's birthday dinner, Ethan raised his glass and announced, "Here's to the real daughter who brings joy to this family," gesturing toward Vanessa while deliberately avoiding my eyes. The room laughed and clapped. My mother beamed. I forced myself to sip my wine, though the glass shook in my hand. I thought of the bank account only I knew, about the inheritance already sitting quietly compounding interest like a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. Ethan had no idea, and that ignorance became my shield. But what seared the truth of his nature into my bones was the night he cornered me in the kitchen after one of Vanessa's charity galas. The house was buzzing with guests' laughter spilling through the hallways, but in the quiet kitchen he leaned against the counter, swirling his whiskey, and said in a low voice, "You know you'll always be the poor sister. Vanessa is everything, you're nothing. The sooner you accept that, the easier it'll be." His eyes bored into me, daring me to fight back. I met his gaze, steady, calm, and replied, "We'll see." It was a simple phrase, but the way his smirk faltered told me he felt a chill of something he couldn't name. Perhaps for the first time he sensed there was more beneath my silence. As Vanessa's wedding plans took shape, Ethan's arrogance reached new heights. He bragged about the guest list, about the prestigious venue, about the future they would build together. My parents nodded approvingly, already treating him like a son. Vanessa sent me chore-like assignments for her wedding, instructing me to handle errands she deemed beneath her. I complied quietly, invisibly, each task another stone laid on the path to my moment. Because deep down, I knew the wedding would not just be their celebration. It would be my stage, the place where years of dismissal, humiliation, and sacrifice would collide into revelation. Ethan thought he was scripting the perfect performance of power and superiority, but I was writing a script of my own, one he would never see coming. The months leading up to the wedding were a relentless parade of small humiliations that cut deeper than outright insults. Vanessa seemed to delight in assigning me the most menial of tasks, as though I were her personal assistant rather than her sister. She would call at midnight, her voice sugary sweet. "Bella, could you pick up the custom napkins tomorrow? Ethan and I are swamped." Or she would text me during my busiest workday, demanding, "I need you to drop off deposits at the florist. Don't mess it up." When I protested that I had commitments, she would pout theatrically. "You never support me, Bella. It's always about you." My parents predictably took her side, telling me I should be grateful to be included at all. The irony was staggering. I was bankrolling initiatives and deals worth millions, yet to them, I was a glorified errand runner. Ethan played his part with precision. At family gatherings, he wove cruelty into jokes, turning me into the punchline. One evening, as we all sat around planning the seating chart, he leaned back and said with mock seriousness, "Should we put Bella at the kids' table? I mean, she's practically invisible anyway." Laughter erupted, Vanessa giggling, my parents chuckling awkwardly. I felt my face flush hot, but I forced a smile, scribbling notes as though unaffected. Inside, however, I catalogued every insult, every smirk, every chuckle ammo for the day of reckoning. The cruelty wasn't confined to words. At Vanessa's bridal shower, Ethan made a show of presenting her with a bracelet so lavish the guests gasped. Then he turned to me, eyebrows raised, and said, "Bella, maybe one day you'll find someone generous enough to take pity on you too." The room went silent for a beat before laughter burst forth, nervous and sharp. I swallowed the sting, sipping my champagne with steady hands. Let them laugh, I thought. They don't know what generosity truly looks like. They don't know the checks I've quietly written to scholarship funds, the grants I've endowed under anonymous foundations, the lives touched by my so-called poverty. Each jab was a rehearsal, each insult a brick building the stage I would one day seize. My parents, blinded by their adoration of Vanessa, dismissed my growing unease. When I once confided to my mother that Ethan's comments were cruel, she waved her hand. "Oh, Bella, he's just joking. Don't be so sensitive. Vanessa deserves happiness, and if you love her, you'll support her." Support her. That was the refrain of my life. Support her, even if it means erasing yourself. Support her, even if it means swallowing humiliation until it becomes your native tongue. By the rehearsal dinner, the tension was unbearable. Ethan stood to toast Vanessa, recounting her accomplishments with exaggerated flair, each anecdote carefully crafted to highlight her brilliance, and by contrast, my insignificance. "Vanessa has always been extraordinary," he declared, raising his glass. "Unlike some people, she was destined for greatness." His eyes flicked toward me as he said it, daring me to react. The guests laughed, clinked glasses, and the moment passed as though cruelty were simply part of the entertainment. But behind my polite smile, something hardened. It was no longer just about enduring, it was about justice. After the toast, Vanessa pulled me aside, her eyes glittering with malice beneath the facade of bridal joy. "Bella," she said softly, "try not to embarrass me tomorrow. Just sit quietly, clap at the right times, and for once, don't make it about you." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I wanted to laugh in her face to tell her that tomorrow would be about me in ways she could never imagine. Instead, I nodded meekly, playing the role she had scripted for me my entire life. That night, back in my apartment, I laid out the documents once more, the bank statements, the acquisition contracts, the proof of my inheritance. I traced my finger over the embossed letterhead of the company that had changed my life, remembering every sleepless night, every rejection, every sacrifice. Tomorrow, I thought they will learn who I truly am. Tomorrow, invisibility ends. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and unforgiving sunlight pouring through the hotel windows as if to spotlight the coming storm. I dressed carefully, choosing a gown elegant but understated, a navy silk that whispered dignity rather than screamed wealth. I pinned my hair, simply wore minimal jewelry, and slipped the clutch under my arm, the same clutch that held the envelope of truth. As I arrived at the venue, the Ritz-Carlton ballroom gleaming with gold and crystal, I caught sight of Ethan smirking at the entrance, Vanessa glowing at his side. He looked me up and down, his smirk deepening. "Well," he said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "at least she scrubbed up decently for once." Vanessa laughed, looping her arm tighter around his. Guests chuckled politely, eyes flicking toward me with pity. I smiled faintly, nodding as though in agreement, though inside, the fire raged. The day had come. They thought they were stepping into their coronation, but soon the entire room would see them for what they were, and for the first time in my life, I would no longer be the shadow. I would be the storm. The ballroom shimmered under a canopy of chandeliers, every crystal catching the light like frozen fire. Rows of white roses lined the aisle, their perfume heavy in the air, mingling with the faint tang of champagne and hairspray. Guests rustled in their seats, their designer outfits a blur of silk and sequins, the air buzzing with anticipation. Vanessa floated down the aisle in a gown that looked spun from moonlight, her veil cascading like a waterfall, Ethan beaming at her side as if he had just claimed a prize. My parents, radiant in their pride, clutched each other's hands, eyes misty. I sat 2 rows back, clutching the envelope hidden in my clutch, my heartbeat sinking with the organ's swell. To anyone watching, I was simply another guest, the overlooked sister, the one who had been told countless times to stay small. But inside me, something seismic shifted. The ceremony unfolded in a haze of vows and rehearsed smiles. Ethan's voice rang out as he promised, devotion, sincerity dripping from each word like honey laced with venom. Vanessa giggled through her vows, her tone, saccharine eyes gleaming with triumph. The officiant declared them husband and wife, applause erupted, and as they kissed beneath the arch of roses, I felt the moment crystallize. This was their peak, their golden pedestal, and it was precisely why it was the perfect moment to strike. At the reception, the room pulsed with music and chatter glasses clinking as servers glided with trays of champagne. Vanessa and Ethan basked in the glow of their curated perfection, moving from table to table, soaking up adoration. Then Ethan tapped his glass with a fork, the sound sharp and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice amplified, "thank you for joining us to celebrate not only our love but also the future we're building together." He gestured grandly at Vanessa. "She is extraordinary, isn't she? Beauty, grace, success. Unlike—" His eyes locked on me, a smirk curling his lips. "Some people who never quite figured life out." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Vanessa leaned into his shoulder, her own laughter ringing out sharp as broken glass. My parents chuckled, glancing at me with the same old mixture of pity and reproach, as if silently telling me not to ruin the moment. My chest burned, but my hands were steady as I rose from my chair. The laughter faltered, heads turned. My heels clicked against the polished floor as I stepped into the spotlight, the envelope clutched like a blade. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm, but carrying. The room hushed instantly. Even the band-stilled instruments silenced mid-note. Dozens of eyes bore into me, some curious, others annoyed. Vanessa's smile froze brittle around the edges. Ethan raised an eyebrow, feigning amusement. "Bella," he drawled, "finally found your voice." The crowd tittered. I held his gaze, then swept my eyes across the room. "You've all been told a story about me, that I am pitiful, poor, that I am less." My voice didn't waver. "But stories, as you know, can be rewritten." I opened the envelope and pulled out the documents, the embossed letterheads catching the chandelier's glow. Gasps rippled through the room. 3 years ago, I continued the company I co-founded was acquired. My inheritance from that work, my legacy is worth over $53 million. A collective murmur surged, guests shifting in their seats, eyes darting between me, Ethan, and Vanessa. While you mocked me for being invisible, I said, my tone sharpening, I chose silence. While you dismissed me as nothing, I built something. And while you tried to strip me of dignity, I invested in lives you'll never know, scholarships, clinics, foundations. I let the weight of the words hang, scanning the stunned faces. Then I turned to Vanessa and Ethan, their smug expressions crumbling. "You wanted this wedding to be your coronation. But tonight, everyone will remember what you really are." Vanessa's face twisted, her voice high and desperate. "You're lying! You always try to ruin everything for me." She lunged forward, snatching at the documents, but I pulled them back, holding them aloft. Ethan's mask cracked, his smirk gone, his jaw tight. He tried to laugh, but the sound was hollow. "Cute trick, Bella. Fake papers don't impress anyone." A voice from the back rang out. It was one of my company's former investors, a respected figure in the business community. "They're not fake. I can vouch for her. Everything she's saying is true." The silence that followed was electric, punctuated only by the sound of gasps and whispers. Guests turned to me with new eyes, no longer pitying, but astonished, reverent even. Some clapped hesitantly, then others joined until the room erupted in applause. Ethan's face drained of color, Vanessa trembling beside him. My parents sat frozen, shock etched across their features, their pride in Vanessa collapsing under the weight of the truth. I lowered the papers, my voice soft but resonant. Family is not blood. Family is action. And tonight I choose to stop being invisible. The applause swelled, and for the first time in my life, I stood in the light, unashamed, undeniable. Ethan and Vanessa shrank beneath it, their empire of arrogance crumbling in real time. And I knew with absolute clarity that this was only the beginning of their fall. The applause still echoed in my ears as the music tentatively resumed, but the atmosphere of the ballroom had shifted permanently. The glow of Vanessa's wedding had curdled into something tense and brittle like glass about to shatter. Guests whispered in clusters, eyes darting toward me with awe, toward Vanessa and Ethan with thinly veiled pity or disdain. I slipped the documents back into my clutch, my heart steady, my hands finally free of the tremors that had haunted me for years. Vanessa, trembling with rage, grabbed Ethan's arm, hissing loud enough for those nearest to hear. "Do something!" Ethan's smirk was gone, replaced by a sheen of sweat across his brow. He raised his glass and tried to salvage the moment. "Well," he said, voice cracking, "what a performance. Let's all remember tonight is about love, not theatrics. His words fell flat. The crowd wasn't laughing anymore. The spell was broken. Where there had once been indulgent chuckles, now there was silence and the sharp glint of judgment. I could feel the shift in power as tangibly as the weight of the clutch in my hand. My parents sat stiffly. My mother's lips pressed so tightly they had drained of color, my father staring at his glass as though answers swam at the bottom. Their golden daughter was exposed, their carefully cultivated narrative undone in a single night. And they had no script prepared for this reality. When the band struck up the first dance, the applause was tepid. The guests distracted their eyes, no longer fixed on the bride, but on me. Vanessa swirled in Ethan's arms, her smile brittle. Her laughter forced her eyes, darting at the guests, who whispered behind manicured hands. The photographers meant to capture her radiant joy, instead caught the stiffness of her posture, the tension in her jaw, the way Ethan's grip looked less loving and more possessive. As the night staggered on, cracks widened into fissures. A family friend emboldened by champagne cornered Ethan near the bar. "So you called her poor, huh? Doesn't look like she's the poor one." Others followed subtle at first, then overt, their curiosity undeniable. I overheard one woman mutter, "Imagine humiliating your own sister when she's the one funding half the charities in this city." The narrative had flipped, and Ethan and Vanessa were powerless to stop it. By the end of the night, half the guests had slipped out early, unwilling to toast a couple whose cruelty now tasted sour. Social media buzzed before the cake was even cut. Snippets of my speech, shaky phone videos of Vanessa's desperate protest, whispers of my inheritance. It all spread like wildfire. By dawn, hashtags trended, and the wedding became less a celebration and more a scandal. Headlines followed within days. Blogs dissected the wedding showdown, tabloids devoured the drama, and local news outlets framed it as a morality tale. Ethan, once the brash young lawyer on the rise, found his name dragged through mud. Clients pulled out wary of associating with a man mocked for humiliating the wrong person. Law partners distanced themselves, emails unanswered, calls ignored. Within weeks, his fledgling practice collapsed, creditors circling like vultures. Vanessa fared no better. Brands that had courted her as a socialite quietly withdrew invitations. Charities erased her from gala committees. Friends stopped answering calls. The glittering circle she once ruled evaporated, leaving her isolated, her attempts at denial only fueling gossip. My parents tried to maintain normalcy, insisting to anyone who would listen that it was all a misunderstanding. But the more they defended Vanessa and Ethan, the more out of touch they seemed. Neighbors whispered old friends stopped visiting, and the family's pedestal crumbled. For the first time, my parents tasted what it meant to be invisible. Not because they were dismissed, but because their chosen golden child had been unmasked. I kept my distance not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I had no interest in gloating. Justice had already been served, not by my hands alone, but by the truth finally standing unhidden in the light. When Vanessa called weeks later, her voice shaking, I let it go to voicemail. "Bella, please, you don't understand," she sobbed. "Ethan's gone. I have nothing. People won't even look at me." Her words trailed into static as she hung up, but the weight of them didn't sway me. For once, her suffering wasn't my burden. Ethan tried too, his message colder edged with desperation. "You think this makes you better? You ruined me. Congratulations. But remember power shifts. Don't get too comfortable." His threat was hollow, the voice of a man grasping at air as his empire collapsed around him. And me, I flourished. Invitations poured in, not just to parties, but to panels, to philanthropic boards, to initiatives that wanted my voice, my presence. People who had once overlooked me now sought my counsel, my partnership, my leadership. Yet I remained careful, wary of the same trap that had ensnared Vanessa. I chose my associations with intention, aligning myself with causes that reflected my values, not just my bank account. The world had finally seen me, but I would decide how to remain visible. What mattered most was not their fall, but my rise, not in wealth, but in dignity, in the freedom to finally define myself without their shadows. And in that freedom, I found something sweeter than revenge, peace. Months passed and the storm around Vanessa and Ethan eventually quieted, not because people forgot, but because their downfall had become accepted fact woven into the city's social fabric like a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. They were no longer figures of admiration, but of ridicule, their names invoked, only to remind others of what arrogance and cruelty could cost. For me, the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was liberation. I moved back into the house my parents had once used as a stage for Vanessa's triumphs. The old walls carried echoes of favoritism and neglect, but I refused to let them haunt me. I repainted the rooms in soft hues, filled the shelves with books I had long postponed, reading opened the windows to let in air and light. Slowly the house became mine, not theirs, no longer a monument to exclusion, but a sanctuary of self. Yet even as I found peace, I felt the pull to do more. The inheritance, once a secret I carried like a stone in my pocket, had become a tool, a weapon when needed. Yes, but more importantly, a lifeline I could extend to others. I established the Martinez Foundation, named not for vanity, but for legacy, devoted to scholarships for students from families who dismissed them, clinics for women overlooked by systems grants for those whose voices were silenced. The first time I watched a young woman step onto a stage to accept a scholarship in her own name, tears in her eyes, family cheering, I realized the cycle had broken. What had once been a curse in my family's house was now a gift to strangers who would never owe me anything but their own success. That I thought was wealth worth revealing. My circle too transformed. Gone were the relatives who only valued me when I was silent. In their place grew a chosen family of colleagues, friends, allies who celebrated not what I could provide, but who I was. My closest confidant became Miriam, a lawyer I had met during the legal process of establishing the foundation. She had a laugh that filled rooms, a mind sharp enough to slice through any deception, and a heart generous in ways money could never match. Over coffee one morning, she told me, "Bella, you know what you did. You rewrote your family tree. Blood gave you roots, but you grew your own branches." I carried those words with me, a mantra that replaced the bitterness of the past. My parents remained distant, tangled in their denial. They called occasionally, their voices brittle, asking if I might reconsider, if I might mend the rift with Vanessa. I answered politely but firmly. Boundaries are not punishment, I told them. They're survival. They never understood, but I no longer needed their understanding. What once felt like abandonment now felt like clarity. Vanessa faded further into obscurity. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to a smaller city, trying to rebuild under another name. Her attempts at reinvention undermined by whispers that trailed her everywhere. Ethan disappeared from headlines altogether, a ghost haunting court records, lawsuits piled at his feet. Their fall was complete, but I found no joy in it anymore. Pity, perhaps, but not joy. Their ruin was their own doing. My triumph did not depend on theirs. Years later, on the anniversary of their wedding, the day that had changed everything, I hosted a dinner at my home. Around my table sat scholars whose lives had been lifted by the foundation, colleagues who had fought beside me for justice, friends who had become family in every way that mattered. Laughter filled the air, genuine and unforced, glasses raised not in mockery but in celebration. When one of the students asked how I had learned to keep going when my own family had cast me aside, I paused, then smiled. "Because family is not blood," I said. "Family is action. And those who act with love, with loyalty, with respect, they are the ones who deserve your heart." The table nodded. Glasses clinked, and I felt the truth settle deep inside me. That night, as I stood at the window, overlooking the city, the lights shimmering like a constellation at my feet, I realized the arc of my story had bent not just toward justice, but toward healing. I had carried the weight of invisibility, endured the sting of humiliation, but I had emerged visible, whole, and free. The girl once told to sit quietly in the corner had become the woman who built foundations not just in stone and steel, but in dignity and love. And if there was a moral in all of it, it was this: betrayal can break you, but it can also build you. Wealth can corrupt, but it can also heal. And family. Family is not inherited. It is chosen, earned, created in the small daily acts of loyalty and kindness that outshine bloodlines. That was my legacy. Not the millions in the bank, not the headlines or applause, but the truth that I could stand finally as my self-seen, respected, loved. And as the night deepened and laughter drifted from the dining room, I whispered a quiet vow to the city beyond my window. I will never be invisible again.